So I have a little bit of an around-the-bout song for you today.
Okay.
We've known each other for so long. You've been rickrolled.
Oh.
What color was Rick Astley's hair?
Red?
Yeah.
Ginger colored?
had a-
No soul colored?
He had a testa-ginger, or as we call it in English, a testarossa. Read it.
Got it.
I think on this episode of the Carmudgeon Show, we're going to talk about the Ferrari Testarossa. My name is Jason Camisa. I have two dangly things. That is Derek Tam-Scott. He's got two dangly things also because we are using high-tech recording equipment. Hi, Derek.
Well, at least people can hear us, which apparently they can never hear us in any other context.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we use this. I love this. I have headphones everywhere. We use all the sophisticated thousands of dollars recording stuff and people bitch. And then we use our iPhones and like, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Apple for the win again.
I guess people are conditioned to like Apple products.
I guess. Either that or Apple products just work, which, could actually be the case.
Like a Testarossa.
That's a really great transition. Testarossa works.
It kind of does. Where do you want to start with this? See, I saw you posted on Instagram. You said we were going to do an episode about the Testarossa, and people asked some questions, which I read, even if you didn't.
You know, I'm using my phone to record this. I don't have the ability to go look at my DM.
It's okay. There are lots of comments about them. I read enough of them to get a sense. So people want to understand like the development of the car and like its evolution over time, including the car before it, which I was going to talk about anyway.
Yeah,
and they want to know the changes that happened over the model run, how it drives. I would say those are the primary things. So.
There's an interesting story about the Testarossa because, and I'm gonna ruin the surprise here, but just I want to hook our readers right off the bat. It doesn't drive anything like it looks. It's not the car you think it is.
Yes.
And I think that's something Derek and I have agreed on. The first time I ever drove a Testarossa, I was like, what's going on here? Because it's got what I call E31 phenomenon. And E31 is the BMW 8 series of the early 1990s. It looks like one thing, but it is something very different. So let's start from the beginning and talk about the BB.
Yes.
Which is where the whole story starts. And I have my research, but I think your research is probably more better. So let's start with you, and then I can like poke holes in your arguments and fuck with you while you're...
All right. The BB, which people say stands for Berlinetta Boxer, but in fact does not.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Well, it's one of two things. We don't know what it actually stands for.
Mm-hmm.
We know it doesn't stand for Berlinetta Boxer. Like Ferrari has come out and said, so in traditional lore, 512 BB, 512 was, hold on.
Well, originally it was a 365.
Right. So Ferrari's naming convention back in the day was the number corresponded to the number of cubic centimeters of displacement for each cylinder. So this was 365 cc's times 12 is 4.4 liters or something.
Correct.
And that, so it was the 365 BB, which the media decided stood for Berlinetta Boxer. Berlinetta meaning a coupe, and Boxer meaning a boxer engine. But the engine wasn't a boxer.
Correct. So in order for an engine to be a boxer, each cylinder, which is opposed to its opposing cylinder, they need to be on different crank throws. And in a V12 and in the 180 degree V12 in the Boxer, they actually are the adjacent or opposite cylinders share the same crank throw.
Right.
And so therefore it doesn't fit the technical definition of what a Boxer motor is.
Correct. So you can call this either a 180 degree V12 or a flat 12.
Yes,
but the German term Boxermotor boxer engine, came from the fact that when opposing cylinders, as you said, had crank pins that were 180 degrees away from each other, when you looked at their motion, they did this, which to somebody at some point, probably at Porsche, resembled what boxers did when they were warming up, and that's where that name came from. If these two opposing pistons with the cylinders this way share a crank pin, then they do this. They move in they're moving in the same
Unison.
direction at the same time. So this is not a Boxer, but it is a 180-degree V12 or a flat 12, which is pretty fucking cool. But anyway, okay.
So yes, horizontally opposed. And that was Ferrari's first mid-engined 12-cylinder production car.
1971 they showed it? 3 production?
73, I think. And that was kind of a response to the Miura, because the Miura was this first mid-engined road car, more, not technically, the Matra Jet was. But the Miura created...
Supercar, right?
Yes.
Created the supercar genre.
Exactly. And so Ferrari's response, or their next flagship 12-cylinder car, was Daytona, which was a comparatively conventional car. It was a front-engine transaxle car. And everyone was like, oh, that's disappointing. Like, Ferrari didn't come out with a mid-engined car to respond to the Miura, which was such a sensation. So finally they did with the Boxer, initially the 365, which was carbureted, and that was replaced by the 512. The 512 for the first time was 5 liters, 12 cylinders, not 512 cc's per cylinder.
But
it's
hold
actually
on.
4.9
Wasn't there
liters.
weren't there like 3 different 365s?
No. Of the BB?
Yeah, I thought there was a 365 BB.
There were other 365s, but those were not the mid-engined cars.
Correct.
There was a 365 Daytona. There was a 365 GTC. There was a 365 GT4 2+2, which was the replacement of the GTC. Those are both 4-seat cars. But there was only one
and
car
that was a confusing part of Ferrari's nomenclature at the time. But because the V12 and the flat 12 shared 365 cc per cylinder displacement, it's very
there were a bunch of 365 cars that
Right.
all look different from each other,
Right.
but share the same displacement, which is probably why they changed their methodology. So now the number will tell you what the car looks like, which it did not do at that period.
So they named it the BB, and so there are 2 internal stories that we've heard throughout history that explain what BB stands for. Neither is Berlinetta Boxer. The first one is that it stood for, hold on, you know the term, it means twin cam. Oh no, you didn't know this one? Hold on.
I remember you talking about it before, but I don't know what the term is.
So it means twin cam.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And the other one was Brigitte Bardot, the French actress. And that was as legend has it, when they were working on this project at Pininfarina, they said the curves reminded them of Brigitte Bardot. And so they started calling it the BB, but of course then Ferrari was like, well, we can't call a car after some celebrity. Can't name it
particularly a French one.
Oui, bien sûr. So they sort of came up with the name, either Ferrari or the media came up with the name Berlinetta Boxer. But it could either be Bialbero, which is twin cam, or and don't correct me if my Italian's wrong.
Bialbero. Oh yeah, okay.
Bialbero.
Albero, which is like tree, which is what you call a camshaft in Italian.
Okay.
So yes. So that became the 512. The displacement grew half a liter to 4.9 liters. It was still carbureted. It has the same carburetors as Miura and also an early 911S, which are triple throat Webers. And then they switched to fuel injection. There were 929 carbureted Boxers built and 1,000-something injected ones built. And one of the things about that car, it's generally considered to be very beautiful. The car was never sold in the United States. They couldn't get it to pass emissions. So there are Boxers here now.
Right, it's strange that they couldn't get it to pass emissions, but independent companies could. That was kind of strange. So a lot of them actually wound up here.
Federalized, yes.
With, who knows how many cats on it. Ferrari said it couldn't be done, but independents did.
Yes. So they all came over as gray market cars. And the radiator, like the Miura, the radiator was in the front, and then they had these pipes that brought coolant forward and aft along the length of the car, so that they could have the radiator at the front with the airflow flowing in from the front of the car, which created some heat issues inside the cabin. And that was one of the primary reasons that they did this significant packaging change when the Testarossa came out.
Okay, hold on. Remember, I think it was last week we were talking about your boy David E. Davis and how you loved him so much and he was great. Well, I have a whole bunch of vintage car and drivers over here with all the road tests that they ever did of the Testarossa and a federalized, what year was this car? It was a federalized BB from a company called Amerispec.
Yeah, and they did more of them than anyone else.
Yep. it was one of the harshest reviews I think I've read ever. It was just absolutely fucking mean. And Don Sherman wrote this. I'm pretty sure Don Sherman wrote this, who does not like me at all. We worked together briefly at Automobile. And I don't particularly care for Don, but he's right about a lot of things. And he said, blah, 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 he's bitching about everything. And he was, deep in my heart, I know that somewhere there's a wealthy Ferrari owner who shared this frustration and done the right thing about it. What one really needs to appreciate this car fully is a mirrored driveway. That's the only way to drive a Boxster without missing the best part, looking at it. But your boy, David E. Davis, slammed the shit out of this car. Blah, blah, blah. He was like comparing Ferraris went fast, they made great noise, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Well, the Ferrari will go plenty fast enough around corners in a straight line, but it won't do any of the things that a GM X car or a Ford Fairmont will do. And I hate it. My 30-year love affair with Ferraris had been based on the fact that Ferraris were exotic cars that made sense. They went fast and made wonderful noises and looked terrific, and you could still use one of them to pick up the dry cleaning. The Boxer breaks this useful rule, and I find that unforgivable. And here's my favorite part. If I wanted something useless for $100,000, I'd buy a bunch of congressmen. So I was reading this last night going, and by the way, his whole counterpoint is scathing to that level. And I kind of love that. They're all bitching about how hot it is in the cabin, how you have no chance of ever reaching the steering wheel because the top of the wheel is so far away, and that you can't see out of the friggin' thing. And I mean, they just all slammed the shit out of this car in ways that I can't, you just don't see today in journalism. And then you look at the specs, 5.0 to 60, which was really fast in 1981. This is June 81. Sure. But more impressively, 13.6 at 105 in the quarter mile. It was quick to 60, but first gear revved out to 64 miles an hour. So there's no shift. It was a long gear, and it still managed to get to 60 in 5 seconds. But 105 miles an hour through the quarter mile, holy shit, this car was fast. Okay. So
basically the complaints about the Boxer were that it was too much like a Miura. Because if any of that's, you're reading all that, you're like, oh, it sounds a lot like a Miura. These are a lot of the things I dislike about the Miura. And these were the sort of issues with the mid-engined package. One of the things I think that made the third Italian mid-engined sort of halo car, the Maserati Bora, so good was that it was usable and civilized comparatively.
Right.
Now, the Boxer is a lot more civilized than the Miura, for sure.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It's also a lot more civilized than the Countach, which is just outright awful compared to either. In terms of livability and practicality.
You say awful.
And usability.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, but the sad part is I actually disagree with David E. And then I think actually what makes for an awful daily driver when a car is new makes for a wonderful classic car when it gets old, because you really want an experience.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
And I can't fault David E. on that, because they're reviewing this as $100,000. By the way, $100,000 in 1981 was $300,000 today. So this, was serious money, and they're looking at it as, well, this is a car that needs to work as a car, and we're looking at it now through the lens of history, saying this is a car that needs to be fun.
An experience.
Right.
Yes, needs to feel special.
So I can't
which
really.
the Boxer does.
Yeah.
And so it was very hot inside, and so they moved the radiators to the back of the car. And in order to give them adequate airflow, they put them on the side of the car, which is why the car has those big vents on the side. Which
why the Testarossa.
The Testarossa, yes.
Right.
Sorry, when they transitioned from the Boxer to the Testarossa, they moved the radiators aft so that they didn't have to be piping hot coolant around the occupants and thereby cooking them. And so they put two radiators on the car, one on each side, and then they put the strakes on the side, the cheese graters or whatever you want to call them, cheese slicers, because large openings were illegal in a lot of countries. So they put
especially
including the U.S.
Yeah.
So that was the other thing about the Testarossa, was that it was meant to be a car that was going to be able to be sold in the U.S. market, because the U.S. market had historically been Ferrari's biggest. And so the fact that they couldn't sell the Boxer, which was their flagship car, in the U.S. was quite problematic.
Mm-hmm. Right. So they, in 19 what 81? What 83? What year? I don't remember when the Testarossa started.
84, it debuted at Paris.
Right. Oh, that's right. In 84 at a nightclub the night before the Paris Auto Show. I remember the Lido bar. It was a bar. But they basically had to go back to the drawing board and fix these cooling problems and also shift effort problems and all kinds of other like sort of mid-engine. This is the early days of mid-engine cars. They had yet to really figure out how to make it work. So we had this in the 70s from the Ferrari. We had the 308s and the Dino, the 246 and 206. But that's kind of like, this is the gestation of the mid-engine car. So they had to figure out all these things like getting all those coolant stuff to the back. And
which is now like sort of de rigueur for a mid-engine car.
Well, they kind of, it depends on the car. I mean, Lotus Elise has all of its heat exchangers up front.
That's not a real car.
Okay, but even the 308, which has all of its cooling up front. The radiators
which is from the 70s.
From the same era, but doesn't cook the passengers. So they were definitely, look, first of all, it's not a 5-liter V12 or flat 12. But also there were ways around this, but they chose their best way was to put the cooling in the back, which necessitated these huge intakes. And then
that's also what happened on the Countach. That's why the Countach has those big vents that stick up from the car, because they wanted to put the radiators into the airflow. So there's huge vents that are sort of on top of the Countach, almost on the tops of the fenders. Are like that for a reason. You notice the prototype car doesn't have those because they were like, well, cooling, whatever, it's a concept. Right. But then when they put them in production, the cars gained these huge vents.
Well, and there are other solutions. Everyone's come up with other solutions now. All mid-engine cars have their radiators up front, including 911s. I mean, they're all just done that way. But at that point, their solution was to move the cooling system to the back, which necessitated, number one, widening the back so you can get sort of a triangle shape looked at from above to get airflow to them. And number two, then you had these big openings, and to pass crash, especially in the US, they had to put the strakes in. And if you read period pieces, they tried to hide them. And then at some point came up with this idea that, like, if it's a duck and if, quacks like a duck, whatever, just make it a fucking duck and just write duck on it. And that became this car.
It created one of the iconic calling card for the car.
Out of an engineering necessity, which I love.
Right, and the early reviews of the Testarossa are funny because they're like, oh, this thing is kind of funny looking, and like these awkward vents on the side, and like the car is so much wider in the back than the front, which remains an impression today. When you drive in the Testarossa today, you're like, man, this thing is wide, and evidently it's the widest Ferrari ever made. In fact, a road car.
I mean, the scary part is that the rear is 6 inches wider than the front, which means
so if the front fits, the back might not.
Yeah. Yep. Pulling out of the driveway, you're all fine until you're not. All right, so the Testarossa was actually a re-engineered version of the BB, but
4 valves per cylinder.
New engine, yeah.
Same basic engine, but with 4-valve new heads.
See, that was another thing that I couldn't figure out. It looked like they had the same exact displacement, but somewhere I was told that that there was a completely new development of the engine, or that could have been the 512 TR. Either way. But the 4 valves per cylinder is Ferrari's first 4-valve per cylinder road car engine.
12 cylinders. Because the QV308 came out, right, I think, in 83. They got 4 valves per cylinder right around the same time. So yeah, the 4 valves per cylinder, it has the Bosch CIS K-Jetronic injection system. What else to note about the car? It was more or less the same performance level. The other thing about that both of those cars share, which was a little bit odd, was the transmission was mounted underneath, the differentials mounted underneath the engine.
Yeah, the transmission was below the engine, which, if you think about, a flat engine is not actually very tall. So you can do things like put a transmission below it, although you have a lot of weight really high up, and that's not ideal.
Yes, exactly.
But so the car and driver did 2 tests, again, one in September of 1985 and then one in 86. The 85 was a Euro market car that had yet to be federalized. And 86 was the finally US spec car that they could do. And just like the BB, they both did 0 to 60 in 5.0. Even though they only did 52 miles an hour in first gear, so they had much shorter gearing. And actually, that would tell you that the car is actually faster than the original one, because a 1 to 2 shift on a dogleg, they were dogleg 5-speed, a 1 to 2 shift on a dogleg actually takes a good bit of time.
It
So
certainly does.
you look at these quarter mile numbers, and they're monsters. I mean, the U.S. car in '86 did 13.3 at 107. The Euro car did, I think, similar, was 13.1 at 107. I mean, these were insanely fast cars for the day. And I did see one of the comments on Instagram was like, why don't you put a list of like, ho-hum family sedans that destroy this car in performance in every way? There aren't too many cars that do 107 miles an hour in a quarter mile at this point still, that are family cars. Certainly nothing ho-hum like even a Camry V6, which is a genuinely fast car, ain't doing 107 and a quarter mile. Also, 0.87 G of skid pad grip is insane for that point in time, and actually really good for today, not for a supercar, obviously.
Massive tires.
But my guess is you put modern tires on this thing, if it pulled 0.86 on 1986 tires, it's going to be pulling a G now on even the worst high-performance all-seasons that you could fit on it, if you could get them.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in 15.
Right,
Or,
and
sorry,
well, the early ones were TRXs too, right? So that you have no choice.
Yes. So the injected Boxers, I shouldn't call that, the injected BBs, the BPIs, and the early Testarossas both used the Michelin TRX metric tire, which was only made by Michelin and is very expensive, but thankfully back in production now. And all the early cars, had a single high-mounted side mirror. Those are called the monospecchio, which means one mirror in Italian.
But you can't call it one mirror because monospecchio sounds so much more.
Of course.
Profondo.
And the other thing to note about the monospecchio is that it doesn't fold in, which is a little bit awkward. Which the later cars, the mirrors do fold in, which is nice.
But I bet it's still narrower. As far as that thing sticks out, I bet it's still narrower than the back of the car. So it's a good indicator that
undoubtedly.
Just because
especially
it clears
because of
mirror.
the tumble home, it mounted quite a bit inboard of where the mirror is mounted on the on the two mirror cars.
I mean, it is
the
really cool to look at.
Yes, I've driven the 3 monospecchio cars, and it's like, it is a little awkward because it's in the way sometimes when you're trying to see if someone is coming when you're turning left, for example. And also you miss it on the right side a lot. It's really nice to have a mirror on the right side in that car.
Yeah.
So that was something they tried early on, and then they said, "Ooh, let's put a second mirror on the car and put them in a normal location." Also, the early cars have center lock wheels, which disappeared. I think 87 was the last year of center lock wheels for the U.S., and then they went to conventional 5 lugs. And what else changed? The other thing they changed is the early cars, the odometer is not in the gauge cluster. The odometer is in the center console, just in front of the shifter, for some unknown reason. It's weird if you're trying to find out how many miles the car has, because the odometer is literally mounted like by your kneecap. And then they moved it to the gauges at the same time that they switched to 5 lugs. But other than that, the early cars are all kind of the same. All of 85 to 91 are pretty similar cars. The car is, I guess at this point we should talk about what it's like to drive.
Well, hold on, but there's also this is the thing that was always confusing to me, and I did a collectible classic like 10 years ago on this for automobile. So it started out as a 365 BB, became the Testarossa, and then became the 512 TR, which then became the 512M.
Correct.
And actually the 512 TR, which looks almost identical to a Testarossa with just different front and rear fascias, is effectively a completely new car. They re-engineered where the engine mounted. They re-engineered cooling system again. They re-engineered a whole bunch of stuff.
Suspension, brakes, wheels.
Which is nuts to have a car that on the outside looks exactly the same.
It is so substantially re-engineered, the TR, that it has a different weight distribution.
Yeah. They moved the engine,
rear.
Right?
They moved the engine down, and I think they moved it forward as well.
Yeah.
Because they knew that part of so generally the original Testarossa is pretty benign to drive unless you're really hauling ass, and then it starts to have the high center of gravity, I think, creates some issues, and so they were trying to address that. And the cars do feel really dramatically different if you drive them back to back.
And then the final one, the 512, the M,
is an evolution of the TR. It's pretty. Oh yes, in terms of aesthetics. I don't mind the aesthetics. I don't mind it. It's not the one I would choose.
For that stupid smiley front end, I just don't think. I think they took.
I mean, yeah, you can tell it's mimicking an F355. It looks like a Testarossa that ate an F355.
It's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it does.
It's some incremental changes between the TR and the M, but the M is a lot rarer, and so those are the most valuable. I think 95 M's came to the U.S. They built 500 total M's. So this was Ferrari's most produced 12-cylinder car, I think maybe of all time still even.
I think so. 10,000.
They made 10,000 cars. So there were 7,002 or 300 original Testarossas, and then like 22 or 2,300 512 TRs, and then 501 M's. Right. So the original Testarossa, when you drive it, if you are expecting it to drive like it looks, then you will be disappointed.
Sorely disappointed.
Sorely disappointed. The difference between it and a Countach, the Countach drives like it looks. Like it's like heavy steering, heavy shifter, like you're even at 510, my head brushes this headliner. It's very hot, it's loud, it's like a wild animal that you're trying to tame. Like you feel like you've earned it, and if you are unsure about what you're doing, the car is going to call you out. And it's going to make you look like a fool. It's a car that you need to drive confidently, but also with really good technique. And is that good? I don't know if it's good. It certainly is engaging and challenging, and like it is exciting. An experience, and it's very exciting, and it makes great noises, and it's just a huge, overwhelming experience. And I don't know, objectively it's bad in some ways, but despite that, I really enjoy the experience, and I really like the Countach very much, and I would choose a Countach over a Testarossa personally.
Well, and here's why. The Testarossa is a good car. Like the first time I drove one, I got in it and I was expecting steering that was incredible. So the Testarossa does not have power steering. And yes. So I expected, all right, this 3,600 pound car without power steering, I'm in trouble. I'm never going to be able to move it. Actually, as soon as you're moving, it's light.
As soon as you're moving. If you're trying to parallel park it, it is a pain.
But almost anything that, any car without power assist steering, you just learn, you roll. You just don't start trying to turn the wheel until you're moving at all. Yes. But the Testarossas, once you're moving, the steering's light, and the shifter's okay. The clutch is super easy.
I find the clutch to be heavy.
It's heavy, but it's easy to modulate. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's easy to modulate, but it takes a lot of force. The shifter is very traditional Ferrari. It takes a lot of technique. High shift effort, second gear takes finesse, and especially when cold.
So the cold thing is what I was just about to bring up.
Yeah.
I have never in my life seen a fuel-injected car that runs so poorly when it's cold.
Yes, and they are all like that. Every single Testarossa.
Oh, even in the period road test, they were saying, forget it. It stalls at red light. It stalls at stop signs. It won't accept any fuel. So this is funny. The first time I ever drove one, it was warmed up by the time I got in it, and I couldn't believe how docile the engine was.
Yes,
and it was just
very tractable.
Totally and CIS, like CIS fuel-injected cars are always very progressive, very linear. They respond well. You warned me about a car that we were both driving at Pebble.
Oh, Car Week last year.
And I got in it, and you're like, "Hey, by the way, it's going to be miserable." I'm like, "Shit, it's CIS." How Ferrari fucked up CIS tuning that bad, I will never understand. It starts immediately. I mean, it's like they start and run. The second you try to move or give it any throttle at all, it's violently angry. They will stall. They will sputter. You can flat foot it. Completely neutral, just completely flat-footed, and it won't even respond. It won't start to stall. It just dun, 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 and then hold your foot there, dun, 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 and you can stall it that way. Try to put it under any load, forget it.
Well, and then eventually it'll wake up, and then it'll give you the amount of revs you requested, which actually turns out to have been 4,000, and by this point you're starting to let out the clutch, and so then you look like some jackass who doesn't know how to drive a manual transmission.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like it.
Well, yeah, and I worked at a dealer where we would have like 3 or 4 Testarossas at a time sometimes, and you'd have to move them while they were cold. And so the technique was just you drive it on the clutch only and try not to give it any throttle, or you just do everything in really super slow motion, because we were always moving the cars around while they were cold, and it was just, that's the way they all are.
I saw you driving one. And like you can get into anything with the most miserable, terrible carburation. You don't stall things. You're just, this is your milieu. You're a 95-year-old man. You've driven these cars with carburetors. You understand how chokes work. I was watching you in the Testarossa going, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, is he drunk?
Well, this is at Radwood.
Yeah.
When I brought the Testarossa to Radwood.
What is going on? Yeah. They are the most recalcitrant fuel-injected cars I've ever experienced ever.
When cold.
Yeah.
And when they warm up, they work beautifully.
Beautifully.
Which is true of the transmission as well.
Yeah. But the thing I couldn't believe was so the car that I drove was stock. The first one that I drove was completely stock. Was how incredibly quiet it was.
Yeah, you hear like belts whirring and stuff. You don't hear exhaust. You don't hear mechanical noises. You hear like belts.
It's just this little flutter that's behind you, and there's nothing of what we expect from 12-cylinder. Like even the V12s, like the Daytonas and the 330s, they don't sound like the V12s that of today. They don't have that incredibly high-pitched shriek, but they have this mechanical complexity and great induction noise, and they do all these things. That Testarossa I was so disappointed with because it sounded and felt like nothing.
Yeah.
Zero.
That is true. If you are beating on it, it sounds pretty decent. And if you get one that has the tubey exhaust, which is the aftermarket, then you hear the exhaust, which is nice. And it is nice exhaust noise. And it doesn't have the raspiness. A Boxer has more raspiness to the exhaust noise. But yes, I would say a tubey is a must because the cars are way too quiet. The car is like maybe 12% louder than a contemporary Jaguar XJ6.
It's like, almost, you know what it reminds me of? 986 Boxsters. 986 Boxsters was the same way. The noise that you heard was a lot of mechanical whirring and stuff, and you got great intake noise on 986s. But the first thing you have to do when you buy a 986 is put a really loud exhaust on it because the noise that's there is wonderful. It's just so not in keeping with the spirit of the car. It's almost it's a total mismatch.
Which is the driving experience in general.
Yeah.
The car is very civilized. It's very competent, high speed, like touring. It's a GT car in essence. It is surprisingly similar to a 928 in terms of like its ideal use case, except for that a 928 rides harder because the Testarossa actually rides it's very soft, compliant, comfortable suspension. And the other thing, talking about noise, the 512 TR sounds quite a bit different and sounds quite a lot better than the Testarossa.
But the Testarossa was a better driving car overall, right?
No. 512 TR is an appreciably better car in every respect and is worth the 50% money premium that comes with it. Okay. It feels much more lively and lithe and lighter and more like a sports car without really giving up anything in terms of usability to the Testarossa. And the other,
the interesting thing is going back is for as much as everyone hated the early BB in the period road test, they really liked the Testarossa because it was docile. And although they did say it does alternate between initial understeer and snap oversteer, less so than the BB did, which
because there's a wider rear track.
Right, and they basically it sounds like those BBs were nightmares. I mean, just nightmares to control, and it would have been better maybe if it had faster steering and you could actually reach the steering wheel and all that other stuff.
I've never driven a BB fast. I've driven a few BBs, but generally I like. They are not as bad as people say they are. It's not compared to a Miura, it's very civilized, for example. So it's all about reference point. There's a decade or a decade and a half of development. So I like driving BBs. I wouldn't try to drive one hard. But I think for just driving around, I wouldn't try to drive around corners really fast.
Right, I wouldn't go crazy in it. Just because of how many people said in period road tests that the car was a nightmare. It was just, always unpredictable.
Yes.
But so the period test really liked the Testarossa because it was civilized.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, you and
depending
I don't
who you're
like
reading. Because some articles are like, oh, it's kind of like underwhelming and sleepy and sort of too civilized.
Period stuff?
Yeah. I found a period review for Motorsport, and that was their thing. At the end, they were like, the thing is so competent, and it's so good at just anything you want. You could sit in traffic in it, or you could, overtake large numbers of cars, and it works, but it loses some of the sort of like the thrill and drama of Ferraris in the past, which is very much true. I mean, my old colleague at the dealer that I used to work at we sold a lot of Testarossas. He said it's a 180 mile an hour sofa,
Right.
which I think is a great way to put it. You don't think it's going to be that kind of experience. You don't think it's going to be this civilized grand tourer that's quiet and
Certainly
has air
doesn't look like it
conditioning.
would be. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that if your expectation is that it's going to be like an F40 or a 288, this sort of exciting, visceral, thrilling experience, it's not. But I mean, I think in some respects the car was really well judged for the audience. I mean, they sold more of them than any other Ferrari. This was, let's not forget, during the 80s. The 80s, it was a period, the yuppie era, right? So I think the most yuppie-ish cars ever are the BMW E30, and then followed by the Porsche 911, followed by the Testarossa. I think those are the three sort of economic strata of 80s cars, right? If you were saying what is a yuppie is a young, upwardly mobile professional. And so they're like, I'm going to buy a car because of what it says about where I've gotten in my life. So I'm going to buy a BMW 3 Series. And then you're like, now that go to the next level, you're like, no, it's going to be a Porsche 911. And these cars become status cars. And I think the Testarossa was sort of at the top of that heap. And they had, multi-year waiting lists. I mean, I remember in 1989, the cars stickered for around $100,000. In 1989, they were selling for $300,000, even though they were still in production, and they built 7,000 of them because there was so much demand for this type of consumption. And they were selling these cars to people who were buying them for status instead of people who were buying Ferraris in the 60s who were like, I'm super into sports cars and I want this sort of really world-class engineered, like racing-derived experience. They were like, no, these people want to show off. And so they created a car that was effortless and civilized to go fast, and that all these people who are buying it for sort of 1980s type reasons would end up with a product that wasn't going to kill them or alienate them as customers.
So as someone who was alive in the 1980s, I disagree with you on one car, and that I don't think it was 911 at all. At the time, they were so old and funky and cool. It was 928s. So E30 was definitely the one. And by the way, no one ever drove an E30 because it was a good performer. They drove it as a status symbol. And I'll never forget my mom test driving one in 1987 at my insistence, because of course I was reading the car magazines and I'm like, these are great. And the 325i had just come out, and the high-riding motor. And she was like, $23,000 for something the size of a Cavalier? Forget it. It's shitty. There's no luxury in there. And I'm like, it's not a luxury car. It's a sports sedan. And she's like, really? It's got nothing to it. And she wanted buying a Peugeot, which was a better match for her anyway. It was a 505 STX with a V6 in it. But this was the sort of yuppies were like, hold on, I want a coddling luxury car. I don't want this sports car. So BMW hit the right design and the right image, but then the car was a letdown to them. 928s were like the ultimate, like, I want to go fast and I don't want to have to learn how to drive, which would be a 911 owner. So that abortion of a car became a yuppie car. And then so did the Testarossa for really rich yuppies. And you're right. But I think that's what Enzo wanted to do. I mean, if we look at Enzo's personal
yes, he
cars,
was in his 80s by then.
He was not one for sporty street cars. I think he
he always drove a 2+2.
Right. He always drove big, comfortable GT Ferraris. And so I always find that really fascinating. Like, we as a car enthusiast group look at Enzo like, oh, he's all hail the king of the sports car. But reality, I don't think he wanted to build sports cars. Certainly not for
not for the road. I mean, he wanted to either build a race car. He wanted to build a race car, or he wanted to build a car that could deliver performance without abusing him as on the street, which is kind of a sort of sensible grown-up thing to do. That is not a point that young enthusiasts have reached.
Right.
That theoretically would be me if I weren't 95.
Yeah, you're right. But it's such a mindfuck. First of all,
yes, it has luggage space also and functioning air conditioning. I would say it's still not an easy car to drive. It's easier than you think, but it's not as easy as an E30. Shifter. So think about the shifter.
Okay, look, yes, is it not as easy as the E30? The visibility is good, but it's not that good. The front end, the overhang is about as long as an entire E30. So you do have to watch where you're going, plus the width and all the rest of the stuff. But when I got in one for the first time, my first notes were, this is a 7 Series with amazing steering. It rode
AKA
like
180 mile an hour sofa.
Yeah. Couldn't believe how quiet the road noise was. Couldn't believe how good the ride quality was. How quiet the
really
engine
soft,
was.
compliant.
The engine had none of the resonance weirdness that you get in like a 911. Like, one of the things I kind of like about a 911 is even like in a 996, which is probably the least 911 of all the 911s, you get all these different resonances at different RPMs and loads, and just, the car buzzes in exciting. None of it in the Testarossa. The engine is just, might as well be an electric motor. In terms of vibration.
A lot of torque down low, very tractable. That was one of the things, because in the 1980s that was not normal.
No.
We take it for granted now, but when you drive it now, you're like, wow, this thing will pull from 1500 RPM without
But it also
faltering or
never
so much of a
really
hiccup.
woke up, and that was the thing. It just
You get some
pulled,
like induction roar and some noises at the sort of mid-range. I agree, it doesn't do what previous 12-cylinder Ferraris did.
They're a different mission. But
it's not. Yeah, by contemporary standards, it is pretty. It's very civilized and a little not one-dimensional, but it has fewer dimensions or less texture than.
It's not what we associate with a Ferrari.
Correct.
And I think that can be a really good or a really bad thing. Look, I kind of want a Testarossa because, first of all, I want to look at it. I absolutely adore the way they look now, and did even then. I mean, I'm kind of now, I'm sort of an anti-supercar kind of guy always, and I just think part of that, I think, comes from the people who tend to buy them for the yuppie reasons that you were just talking about. But I never really was like, as much as I love an 812 Superfast, and I think it's genuinely the best 12-cylinder Ferrari of all time, or would be if it had a manual. I've always loved the Testarossa. It was so outrageous and so fun that I always put it visually in the same category as a Countach, which you can't fault. Like, that car's existence is to be silly and funny and over the top and make people laugh and smile and bring joy to their day.
And gawk.
Right, and the Testarossa did that in a time when none of the other Ferraris did.
Oh, and I think that just the back is so spectacular, and the way that it was treated, and the width of the car. I mean, they were really owning the car's dimensions, especially the way that the full width, like horizontal lines, like let's accentuate the width of the car.
Yeah, this is what I love about it. Know who you are, know your faults, know your weaknesses, know your strengths, and play to them. Just fucking own it. Be self-aware, and I love that in people who are fucking nuts or fringe in this way, and don't try to hide it. People just let your freak flag fly. And in this case, Ferrari put a lighting on the freak flag. It was like, hey, look over there, we're having fucking fun here. And I love that about it.
When you look at it, but then when you drive it, you're just like, this is quite accessible and civilized.
Right.
And
which is probably why I don't own one, because I don't like my cars to be good. Which is such a fucked up thing to say, but
you're a Countach guy.
I guess of the two, I would. Wow, that's an interesting question. Which one would I actually buy? I would have to have them for different reasons, because the Countach is. I've only driven one briefly, and it was miserable by all objective purposes, but I loved how terrible it was. I loved that experience. We come back to this. Like, I can't fault David E. or Don Sherman or any of the guys that reviewed this car in the day. The BB back in the day, because what they were saying was it's a terrible car, which becomes a positive over time. The question, I guess, is the Testarossa's inherent goodness something that became a negative over time? And I think maybe for someone like you or me, a little bit. For other people, it's probably not. Like, it's probably a really good thing that the car, once it's warmed up, is easy to drive and comfortable and smooth. And I would take a 1,000-mile road trip in that car in a second.
Exactly. Or like you've seen what Harry Metcalf did in his. He went from England to Morocco.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like driving over washboard unpaved roads. He's like, this is 30 minutes I've been on an unpaved washboard road. It's like, and he also drove his to the south of France and put an outboard Honda motor in the trunk of it, like a boat engine. And he was like, well, I had to put it in there because I had bought a case of champagne, and so I had to move the champagne because I was driving across France. Like, he's insane, of course, in the coolest possible way. But yes, it's a car you can absolutely do that with. Whereas 1,000 miles on the Countach, I would die of dehydration just from
100 miles on a
sweating it out.
You can't.
Yeah.
You're not going to do that.
But of the two, I would personally own the Countach, because it is just such an out there experience. Like, it's overwhelming. It's very similar to the Miura, but worse, I think. in some ways because the windows don't open.
Right. Well, this is one of the other funny things when I was going through all my notes, I wrote is that, and this is going to offend everyone, so deal with it. Sorry.
Why do you even apologize for offending everyone?
Well, because I try to be nice, but at the end of the day, it's just not humanly possible. In sort of popular culture, we think of Italians. If you had to whittle Italian men down into two categories, they're either complete grease bags, slime buckets, or they're the most gentlemanly men of all.
Yeah, Gianni Agnelli types.
Right, and the Countach is a complete sleazeball in the worst possible Italian way. And the Testarossa is the biggest gentleman you'll ever meet. Incredibly well-mannered.
Well-dressed.
Well-dressed. It does, it's just so bizarre that Italy, at least to Americans, has this sort of image, is one or the other, bifurcated image. And it's exactly what these two cars are.
And they were kind of the only competitors of each other. If you think about mid-engine 12-cylinder cars in the 1980s, those were your two choices. And they were so different in character, despite both making such strong visual statements. It's really shocking how different in character.
Yeah. And they were two of the fastest cars in the world. I mean, 181 miles an hour was what car and driver got out of their Testarossa. 176 out of the U.S. car, 181 out of the European car. And even the BB did 100 in some insane speed, just absolute 164 miles an hour in 1981. I mean, these were among the fastest accelerating and highest top speed cars ever made at that point. And the fact that Ferrari was as livable as a current 7 Series is a really impressive achievement.
Yes, I'd still have the Countach though, because I'm seeking the experience.
Yeah, but if you had to have one,
I would very much like to own a 512 TR. The 512 TR is, to me, it's so that much more exciting and visceral. I think they realized what they had done with the TR, and they were like, okay, let's liven things up a little bit. And the character of the motor, the noise of the motor, the way that it changes direction, it's one of those things where you make a series of what appear to be relatively non-invasive changes that dramatically transform the character of the car. And so for me, the 512 TR I would adore. I mean, I would own a Testarossa as well. Although, if you say a Testarossa is $100,000, I would. There's another Ferrari I would buy for $100,000 instead of a Testarossa personally, which would be a carbureted 4-seat 365 GT4, which it looks like a 400i basically. Right. It's a 400i with a smaller motor with 6 carburetors and knockoff wheels, basically. But then you get the noises, and it's owning the fact that it's kind of an elegant touring car. And so for me, that would be and there's just something like you've used this term with 4-seat Ferraris before, which is the term douche-proof. I think a Ferrari that's douche-proof is a 4-seater in a sort of elegant, understated color, and so that's where I would go. And I just love the experience with the Webers. So I would probably,
cars, but I mean, just styling-wise, they're on the top of my list.
Yeah, I would have that and a Countach instead of a Testarossa. Although the Testarossa is kind of the combination of those two experiences into one car.
If you had one,
so if you had to have one car, then I think that could kind of. It splits the difference, interestingly.
It's amazing when you look at the production numbers. That they have 10,000 of them. I can't believe they're still as expensive as they were. But they have a cocaine mirror. I mean, if you want to capture the zeitgeist of the 1980s, there is no better car to do that in. And from what I've heard from mechanics who work on them, they're really reliable.
We had a customer who he would do all his own belt services, because those are those 5-year engine out belt service cars. But he would do all his own belt services, and last I heard, he bought it new and he had 250,000 miles on his Testarossa. He drove it everywhere.
Original engine too?
I think it had been rebuilt either once or twice. I forget.
I mean, I'd be surprised if they lasted more than 100, that much more than 100K. But yeah, that's what I've heard, is that they're stout. You got to do the routine maintenance. Again, those belts are 5-year, 30,000.
Well, and they don't like to sit. Right. There's just stuff starts to go wrong if they sit.
That's with all cars. But yeah, no, I mean, it's such a neat idea to be able to get something that looks like that and fool everyone. They think, oh, they must be miserable. Oh, it's got to be a torture chamber in that car. Nope. Nice luxury. Cool cars, really cool cars. Kind of the ultimate douche car of the 1980s. That's kind of douche proof now.
So many of them are red. That was also from the peak red era.
Yeah, well, that had the best line of all people about that. When Gene Jennings, who was Gene Lindemuth at the time, reviewed, I think it was for Automobile at the time when she and David E. started Automobile. She called it the reddest car of all time, and that's totally right. It's the best description. It's the reddest car of all time. So if you want the most Ferrari of all time, it drives the least like a Ferrari, but actually is the best Ferrari visually. Yeah, I take one. All right. So did we wind up answering everyone's questions from?
I don't know. I didn't write them all down. Let me review the comments that I wanted to make to see if
I was going to have to go back. I'm going to have to go back on Instagram and read everyone's comments. I saw one. Does it really drive as bad as they say? It does absolutely not. It drives wonderfully.
Yeah, it doesn't drive bad.
It just drives differently than you expect.
Yeah, it's civilized and easy, except for you just have to know how to operate the shifter, and the steering is kind of heavy at low speeds. So yeah, here's the comments that I wrote from the Motorsport article, was that they thought it was ugly, they thought it was competent, fast, smooth, that it lacked urgency. That's what it is. Lacks urgency was the way that they described it. The motor, the character of the motor,
that's a perfect description. The other thing was Car and Driver said in a bunch of spots, they talked about the styling, especially on the black one, which they had in there, and they were basically like, just reserve your judgment until you see it in person, because what looks jarring in person with the lines actually works. What looks jarring in photos works in person, and I think, well, we can't undo that. We know what these cars look like. So to us they look amazing no matter what.
If you photograph it correctly, I've had the pleasure of photographing probably 10 of these cars over the years, and they are really fun cars to photograph, because if you get the angles just right, you can really
that shelf.
Accentuate the
So this is
the fenders.
Rich Seppos. The Ferrari Testarossa experience is like a rich man's version of a triple dip banana split with hot fudge and all the toppings. It's much too sweet to enjoy at every meal, but there is no finer dessert for special occasions. I think you got that wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be driven all the time.
I think
what he said is actually true about is true about Countach's.
Right.
Because the Countach is so gnarly that you want to drive it like occasionally, but make every mile count.
Yeah.
It's what I call junk miles. I have this term. My friends will be like, "Why don't you drive X car or whatever?" Like I do this with my 500e because it's low mileage. But it's like I don't want to put junk miles on my car. I want to make sure every mile has
counts.
Joy.
Yeah.
And so if it's a car with low mileage, you're like, or whatever. If it's a car that's that intense to drive that you can't drive it every day, then you want to make sure that every mile is a pleasurable one, which means you're not sitting in traffic and you're not like driving around in the city. You're like experiencing joy.
So I'll bring this to a conclusion with David E. Davis, your boy, again. He hated the BB, and when he reviewed the Testarossa, he absolutely loved it. It's a lovely.
Because he was old.
Well, he wasn't that old, but it was more like, he started out, but he says, I never liked the Ferrari 512 Boxster. It was a silly boy racer kind of car. I could never get comfortable sitting in it, let alone driving it. Now along comes the Testarossa, and I'm more than pleasantly surprised to find that I'm perfectly comfortable behind its steering wheel and quite willing to drive your new one from here to Seattle or wherever you'd like it to go. This is a real car. Doesn't hurt that it has 12 cylinders.
Right, he's also the guy who said everyone should own a 12-cylinder car.
Exactly. This is a real car. I enjoyed the 308 Quattrovalvole, pronouncing it the first non-12-cylinder Ferrari I'd ever really loved. Now they're building a 12-cylinder Ferrari that anyone in his right mind could love. The cockpit is roomy. The amount of taste employed in the discreetly restrained interior design is laudable. Best of all, the car is enormously easy and reassuring to drive. Let me hasten that to say that I mean that it was meant to be driven. It is a lovely car in which to go hard and fast. It is not a museum piece, nor should it be treated as one. And I think he got most of that right.
And because they made so many of them, that's actually true, because you're not worried about like, there's only 180 of these in the world. I can't, use it up.
But that turn of attitude is very much indicative of what journalists have to do. Like you're all of a sudden put in this position where you're reviewing a $300,000 car, that was effectively, it was $100,000 in 115 in 1985. does it function as a car? Well, no, therefore I'm going to be hard on it. When he was really, really gentle on the Testarossa because Ferrari had taken a lot of the flaws out of it. And I find that it's something I really always keep on the front of my brain when I'm reviewing, an A12 Superfast. It doesn't need to be an everyday car. In fact, if it's too good of an everyday car, I don't think I'd give it as good of a review because I worry that the people who
you lose
buy
the
this
theater.
Well, we have to remember the people who buy these cars have a Range Rover and they have a G-Class and they have an S-Class and they have all these other cars, these other tools to choose at other different times, which is why I don't like, the sort of modern crop of very civilized, very easy to drive supercars with automatics. Because I feel like we wind up missing something. And what the car companies have put back in is artificial noise, like exhaust bypass valves, where the car is really loud on startup and then shuts right back down. So you get this, and then everyone jumps and then the car quiets back down because it wants to give the owner this feeling of something special, but not really beating them up so much. And I think that's all a function of the sort of media and owners saying, the media more than anything else, saying, I want these cars to be really good. And then looking back on it, actually, they're not all that much fun. And we'd much prefer something like a Countach that's just fucking terrible in all the objective ways. So that's my piece on, sort of what journalists have gotten wrong and right about these cars. Yeah, they were much better, but I'm not sure that's what we look for in collecting cars.
I think it's worth buying one. They have built enough of them that they are relatively affordable. I mean, they cost maybe a little bit less than half of what a comparable Boxer is. The Boxer is a lot rarer. I think they built a quarter as many Boxers as they built Testarossas. And despite all the contemporary complaints about the Boxer, I think it makes a great car now in terms of experience. And so I would choose a Boxer probably over a Testarossa. Ooh, that's a tough. I would choose a Boxer.
I've driven one, but from everything I've read, I would too. Although I want the car to look like a Testarossa. Here's the thing about the Testarossa is it looks so good that it doesn't. I don't give a shit. Like I wouldn't care what it drove like, because just the act of looking at it and interacting with it is such a special thing that it would be enough.
I don't have that much. I don't have such a strong preference aesthetically for the Testarossa over the Boxer the way that you have.
Probably for me. It's probably a kid thing. Like I played Outrun, Sega Outrun. That car featured. That car is just everywhere, and it was just the coolest looking thing in the world. And to date, nothing has ever looked the same.
Yes.
So
it's more visually arresting, especially in person. Just at the back, I cannot get over the back of the car, especially if you view it from low. Yeah. I'll include some photos. I think it's really a cool aesthetic experience.
The only car, and you're going to think I'm absolutely out of my mind on this, that gives me that same, oh my God, it's a rectangle that's super wide and super low, is that Polestar 1. When you see that on the road, you see a rectangular box of taillight and trunk, basically, that is cartoonishly low and wide compared to the rest of the car. And I think that might be why I love the way the Polestar looks on the road so much, because it reminds me of this Testarossa. Obviously, is nowhere near as extreme. The Testarossa won't fit in the goddamn lane. It barely fits on the whole road. And then you could step on it. It's so low. But that sort of exaggerated rectangular element of styling from behind is just magical. The car's great. I can't believe they're only $100,000. And
it's because they built so many of them.
Yep. If they had built 2,000 of them or 1,500 of them the way they did all the other mass-produced high-volume Ferraris, these cars would be $1 million a piece.
I think 500, but yes.
Whatever, some unattainable number, right? $100,000 is a lot of money. But if you had to choose between a new M3 or an M4 and this thing, no question. First of all, and then you complain, oh, I got to do a timing belt every 3 years and it's a full engine out. Yeah, that's $8,000 or $10,000. That is pales in comparison to the depreciation of an M4. And the experience of driving. You have a dog leg, 5-speed.
It even has a great door shut noise. Like the door shut noise is like a Mercedes G-Wagon almost. Like it has great, like a perceived quality. The metallic clink, like the quality is very different, because old Ferraris were really like, it was about the motor. And this thing actually has like a sort of sensation of quality, which actually isn't in present.
I love how you're such a nice guy. You're like, old Ferraris were, in what we heard internally there as you were speaking was, old Ferraris are complete and utter pieces of shit. But what came out of your mouth was, old Ferrari, well, it's about the motor. I like how measured and diplomatic. You could be a congressman. In fact, we could buy $100,000 worth of congressmen if we wanted something useless. You should say what you think. Ferraris were shit. They were built terribly.
I mean, it depends on what era you're talking about, but they definitely had some dodgy quality stuff that they turned out to the masses.
Right, it wasn't what they focused on. They were. You look at the welds in some of these cars. Oh, they're fucking terrible. It's embarrassing.
Yeah. And just some of the stuff that they left exposed, you're like, was that really like a wire routing, or did you just like throw the wires like in somewhere where you're like, oh, no one's gonna even look at it, even though it's plainly visible.
Got an espresso and a cigarette, and we're like, man. Okay. Alrighty then. Well, I think it's settled. I want a Testarossa, but not enough to have one. Also, I don't have $100,000, and I can't drive it anywhere anyway. We're still. I think we're at what today's day 560 of shelter in place.
I believe you. I haven't been counting. Too depressing.
Is that right?
All right. Happy trails. Don't go driving.
Okay. See you. Bye. Oh, by the way, if you guys like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell, and then you'll find out. You'll get a little push notification in an email every time that we publish something like us bitching about cars or Spotlight. A new Spotlight dropped last week. A new one is going to drop. This drops on Wednesday in 2 days from now if you're watching this when it first dropped. They're going to be dropping regular, so you're going to want to subscribe. And then go to ISSIMI.com to go find out what cars we have for sale. And if you're lucky, you can deal with Eric as a salesperson and torment him.